Welcome to the second day of the RISE Annual Conference 2021. We have three exciting sessions for you today, the third being a little bit different. You'll find out more about that from Kirsty later on. But let me hand over straight away to UAE, who's going to chair our first session on management.
Hi, everyone. I'm not Renata Lemos, who unfortunately can't join us today, so we'll have to do without her wealth of experience. And also, unlike Renata, I'm not cited in two out of the three papers on this panel, but I am a RISE fellow where I'm responsible for synthesizing research on teachers and management, so I'm supposed to also know some stuff. And fortunately, also Renata did share with me some of the thoughts about how she wanted to frame this panel. So just to get started with those. So Renata wanted to emphasize that governance really is an important binding constraint on educations around the world, and management's a big part of that. And there's increasing attention to management of frontline providers, so specifically schools, whether it's in measuring them or in designing programs and tools to help them be better managers, or even selecting better managers. But there's still a lot to learn about management. So areas like how to define it, what goes on in the broader context beyond the frontline, and how all of that can fit together to improve practices in school. And so how the three papers here fit together is that they highlight aspects of management for which we don't have much evidence yet, and including some aspects that we might not even think about as management, sorry. And I did also want to flag a handful of connections between the three papers today, as well as some of the sessions yesterday. And I think one sort of underlying theme across these papers is that despite management sometimes being associated with really structured or standardized processes, all of these papers also show that management's really closely connected to beliefs and how they affect decisions. And I mean, as we saw yesterday in the session on politics, the third session, education really is a social and relational process. We also heard about that in the session on parental demand for education, which was session 2 yesterday. And when we're talking specifically about management, accountability, governance, these are relationships, and they're relationships between humans and not robots. Hence, agency, interpretation, beliefs, perceptions all matter crucially. And so our first paper from Gabriela Smarelli focuses on within school management, specifically on school management of violence in Peru. And yesterday, I think in the Q&A for the parental demand session, there was actually a bit of a question about violence affecting demand for education in externally instigated instances of violence. So today, Gabriela will tell us a bit about within school violence. Oops, is that an echo? Anyway, well, and so after Gabriela's paper on within school management, then we'll move to a paper from Jakub Vasilier, where he'll be talking to us about the interaction between management at the school level and management at the local government or mid-tier level. And so that will be a paper on school governance and quality assurance reform in Tanzania. And our third paper from Lee Crawford, which will be about sort of the interaction between the global education architecture and in-country senior policymakers in how they make decisions and manage their education systems. This is about discrete choice and survey experiments with senior officials in 36 developing countries. And I think this is in some way an analog between the conversations we had in session 1 yesterday about citizen-led assessments, about the question of, so that was talking about how citizens and communities can take ownership over educational processes. And this is thinking about questions of ownership and priorities, but at the national to global sort of level of interaction. Right, so that all said, in terms of structure, each presenter will have 15 minutes, then we'll do Q&A. Two of our presenters, Gabriela and Lee, are at the Oxford Hub. One of our presenters, Jakubis, is at the DC Hub. And then after that, after they present, we'll have Q&A. And this will be questions both taken in person at the hubs and via Zoom. So if you're using the Zoom Q&A, please use the Q&A function and not the chat. Also, if you're at one of the hubs, please also indicate that in your questions so the people at the hubs will know to call on you in person and you get to ask your question live. And also, if you're in Oxford, you could just wave at me and try to get my attention and we will call on you. So on that note, thank you very much. And Gabriela, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be presenting here in person, and thank you everyone here and also online. Today, I will be talking about improving school management of violence, and this is evidence from a large-scale intervention that was implemented in Peru. And when we talk about school violence in this paper, we are talking about any form of violence, including sexual, physical, and psychological, that can occur as an isolated event or that can occur repeated times against the same victim. The latter one is commonly known as bullying. Recent evidence has allowed us to identify that globally a third of students aged between 11 and 15 years of age has been victims of school violence. And Peru is one of the countries in the Latin American region that has one of the highest victimization rates. Several studies have already shown that there is an association between exposure to school violence and negative well-being outcomes for the children. This includes negative outcomes related to school dropout, school mobility, lower performance, and also mental health issues. And this negative consequence exists not only for the victims of bullying, but also for the perpetrators and the bystanders. Several laws have been enacted worldwide to ensure the safety of children within schools, and also particular NGOs have been implementing school prevention programs that either follow a whole school approach, meaning that they target both the school staff and the students, and student-only approaches that target mainly the students. However, there is very little robust evidence regarding the impact of these type of programs on both violence and educational related outcomes, and this is particularly the case for low middle income countries. So the objective of this paper is to contribute to this research gap, and I'm going to do this by looking at the case of Peru. I will be analyzing the impacts of a policy that was implemented in Peru and that consisted on training the school staff, particularly the school principal, on the prevention and management of school violence. As such, this intervention is following what we can call a staff-only approach. I'm going to analyze the impacts of this intervention by exploiting the eligibility rules that were used to select these schools, and I will be using a fuzzy regression discontinuity design, and I will be able to analyze the short-term impacts of this intervention, both on violence-related outcomes and also on educational-related outcomes. As a preview of the findings, I observed that the schools that benefited from this intervention increased their likelihood of reporting a case of violence by 37 percentage points. I also observed that the number of reports of violence increased in average by 1. I observed a decrease in the likelihood of switching schools by 3 percentage points. And I don't observe any impacts on school dropout or in test scores. And I will explain later more the potential story behind this. In the interest of time, I will just briefly mention that this paper relates to 3 streams of literature. First, the one studying more the effectiveness of this type of school violence prevention programs. The second one more related to the school management literature, but focusing specifically in the management of a specific task. And finally, it also relates to the human capital formation literature by trying to understand what is the link of these type of programs with educational related outcomes. Very briefly, regarding the data, I am using different sources of public administrative data that allow me to have information of all public schools in the country. This includes school characteristics, student characteristics, test scores information, and also a unique data set on the reports of violence. I will also use primary survey data that gives me some information related to the implementation of the program and the response of the schools to this program. So what is this intervention about? This intervention was designed by the Ministry of Education in Peru, and it was implemented by the local offices of the Ministry of Education. And it consisted on 3 cycles of activities. The first cycle of activities included training about identification of cases of violence and management of violence. And this includes detailed protocols about how to act if you have a case, for instance, of sexual violence versus a case of physical violence. The second cycle of activities consisted on training on strategies of positive discipline. And this was particularly important for Peru because they wanted to move away from punitive discipline. And finally, the third cycle of activities consisted on training about how to design coexistence rules. Because of budget constraints, the government only offered this intervention to 12 schools in each of the local offices of the ministry. I will be referring to these local offices as Lemos. And they categorize the schools in two groups. They have what they call nuclear schools, that in the graph that you can see, it refers to the schools highlighted in black. And these schools were selected based on the levels of violence, about how far they were from the local office, that is the triangle in red, and also the number of enrolled students. Then they selected what they call the adjacent schools. And these are the top 9 schools that are as close as possible to one of the nuclear schools and that had the higher number of enrolled students. In this paper, I will focus on the adjacent schools, and this is mainly because the nuclear schools were also exposed to a different program, so this will allow me to identify better the impacts of the intervention. And a second reason is the eligibility criteria of the adjacent school provides an opportunity to evaluate the causal effect of this program. So the empirical strategy. Through qualitative interviews with the Ministry of Education, I learned that this process of selecting the schools mimics a ranking procedure, meaning that the top 9 schools were selected based on how close they were from the nuclear schools and also the number of enrolled students. Therefore, all the schools that are above this threshold rule of 9 are those schools that weren't selected because they were a bit too far or because they had a lower number of students. I don't have data about these schools that were not selected. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna replicate this ranking procedure, and I'm gonna use this ranking as my discrete running variable. What we can observe in this graph is that the probability of treatment jumps discontinuously at the threshold. I have normalized the threshold to 0. That's why you can see there the 0. And you can also see that the probability jumps in less than 1. And this makes sense because the Ministry of Education made certain exceptions in the selection of some school in some of the local offices. Regarding the estimation, I use a standard 2-stage least square procedure, and I would basically instrument the treatment dummy by a predicted eligibility dummy that takes the value of 1 for those schools that are below the threshold and the value of 0 for those schools above the threshold. I will include a control that is a parametric function of the running variable, and this can be either linear or quadratic. In this slide, I just want to highlight one important thing, and is that the pretreatment outcomes vary smoothly around the cutoff, and also the majority of covariates vary smoothly around the cutoff. So let's talk about the results. I will be showing you a set of tables, and in these tables, what you will observe in column 1 and 2 are the results that come from a linear specification. Columns 3 and 4 are the results from a quadratic specification, and then columns 1 and 3 include only Lemos fixed effects, and 2 and 4 also include school covariates. And I also want you to direct your attention to the first row in this table, because that is showing you the local average treatment effects that come from the empirical strategy I just explained. So what we observe here is that the likelihood of reporting school violence increased by 37 percentage points. And among the schools that registered at least one case of violence, we observe that there are 2 types of schools. Some schools that reported a case of violence for the first time after the intervention, and other schools that had already reported a case of violence before. So I explored this a bit more, and I observed that mainly it seems that these impacts are being driven by the schools that registered a case of violence for the first time after the intervention. And this is mainly because I observe in this table, in the first 2 columns, higher and significant coefficients for this group. I also explored the number of reports of violence. And as you can see, we observe an increase by 1 report of violence. This, of course, sounds in absolute terms of something small. And to put this in context, it's important to mention that the median median number of reports is of around 2 reports. And it's mainly explained by these schools that went from having no reports to 1 report of violence. Thank you. So how do we interpret this increase in the likelihood of reporting violence? First of all, as I just discussed, we observed that the likelihood of reporting violence is higher. It's mainly explained by the schools that reported a case of violence for the first time after the intervention. And I argue that this could be also the schools that face the biggest barriers to reporting violence ex ante intervention. So this, it's already something that could be signaled that this intervention is mainly perhaps reducing the barriers to reporting. A second important source of evidence is that through primary data, I learned that 80% of the schools implemented for the first time a set of activities that are very linked to the fact that some of these barriers have been reduced. This includes disseminating information across the school about what are the platforms to report violence, and also includes controls to actually manage faster the case of violence once it occurs. An alternative story could be that we think that the violence levels increase, but I think this story is less likely, particularly considering that reporting data doesn't necessarily equate actual levels of violence. Related to educational outcomes, what I observed is that there was a decrease in the likelihood of school mobility, meaning that there was a lower number of students that were likely to switch to another school. And this decrease is around 3 percentage points. And this is important, especially considering that there is some evidence telling us that there is an association between school mobility and long-run dropout. In these results, I also controlled for residential mobility to be sure that I'm not actually capturing residential mobility, and results remained consistent. I don't observe any impacts related to school dropout. And regarding learning, I observe positive coefficients, but I don't observe any statistically significant outcomes. And one of the reasons for this could be that maybe I am measuring the impacts of this intervention way too soon. Just to remember, this is really short-term impacts. So it would be great to know what happens more in the medium and long term. I do a series of robustness checks, but I'm not going to stop on this. I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. And finally, to conclude, I think it's really important, the research helps to understand better that when we target managerial skills of the school principals, this can have, particularly in this topic, an effect in increasing this likelihood of reporting violence, and also in decreasing student mobility, perhaps through a channel that is more directed towards improving the school environment overall. And there is already some research telling us that perhaps whole school interventions are more ideal. These are interventions that not only target the school staff, but also the students. However, they are also more expensive and difficult to implement at a large scale. So perhaps training first the school staff is a feasible alternative, especially at early stages, when we know that we have to improve more the knowledge and about how to manage school violence. And finally, I hope that this research will contribute to generate some motivation to explore this topic even more, and particularly to understand better what is the connection between these type of interventions and educational outcomes. And it would be great also to study it related to mental health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Now over to Jacobus in the DC hub.
Can everybody in the rest of the world hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Is Abuja there, Nigeria? It was an honor having such a big audience of Abuja there yesterday, which is great. Right, so, and thank you for my students for joining. You are all getting an A for your final course, so I really appreciate that. The title of this is School Governance Reform at Scale, Experimental Evidence from Tanzania. And so I just have to wait for the timer for the slide to change. It's working, great. Okay, excellent. So just a very brief story. Recently, we discovered water damage in our house. And then it turns out there was a very small pinprick of water that created thousands of dollars of damage. The plumber could fix it with a couple of dollar equipment. And we actually needed to re-gut a whole bathroom, but that was way too expensive. We couldn't afford that. In the meantime, we fixed the problem with just plugging the leak. And so in economics, and I'm drawing a little bit from Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize, often what's fun is that we can try and do these kind of plumbing and try and fix problems. In doing that, we often also reveal these deeper underlying big structural issues that might require regutting of bathrooms, although often that's practically infeasible, but there are ways, small, cheap ways to try and improve it. So one of the big challenges in developing countries or across the world really is decentralization has led to these overlapping roles and responsibilities. There are often two different ministries responsible for delivery of education. The one ministry sets the policy and the other ministry does the implementation at a local level. But there's often a lot of confusion about who should be doing what. And in our context in Tanzania, this is very clear that there are these two different ministries that are playing these two different roles, and these ward education officers, which are a key component of this program, 75% of them agree or strongly agree that they struggle to get things done because different people expect different things from them. So this issue of multiple principles is a real big problem. Right, so what do we do in this research? We show that a very low cost intervention can help overcome this kind of principal agent problem, which is inherent in many education systems. We do it in the context of a school governance reform program, which was implemented at scale in Tanzania. Excellent. And so just some background quickly on this reform, on this program. In 2019, government changed what used to be called the school inspectors to school quality assurance officers. It entailed three key changes. One is a shift away from seeing as a source of accountability to a source of support and providing diagnostic feedback. So not a policeman, more of a nurse, and more of a focus on student learning and teaching quality. And a large emphasis on not just ticking boxes, but actually observing teaching in the classroom. So a kind of very promising reform that the government is very excited about and was the big reform at the time of study of RISE, which is, why we decided to study it. And so the key component of this is these whole school visits, where this group of school quality assurance officers visit schools for 2 to 3 days. Prior to that, they fill in this self-evaluation form to self-reflect on how well they think the school is doing. Then these visits last for 2 to 3 days. It's a deep dive. These school inspectors interview teachers, do classroom observations, interview parents, assess students. And then at the end, they provide some kind of assessment of the overall quality across a range of domains, most importantly, across quality of teaching and quality of management and overall student learning. And then they have this exit meeting on the last day where they invite all the stakeholders to come around and to discuss the results of this evaluation. These school quality assurance officers should ideally also then do a follow-up, but in practice, they just did not have enough time to do that, especially because, as I will say right now, they had to launch this and scale this up and visit every single school in the country over a period of 4 years. Aid money was contingent on meeting these targets. So in the period of the study of this program, roughly a quarter of the schools were visited in a period of about 5 months. So it was a very rapid attempt to roll this out, and kind of, so it's kind of a messy implementation that we're also evaluating here. And so the kind of key thing I want to highlight that we were concerned about, and we were also grateful for the evidence from the Indian country research team, which found that almost exactly the same program in India was unsuccessful. So we were increasingly concerned. And we thought that these water education officers are really the key, the solution, because they can visit the schools on a regular basis. They're actually supposed to be there every couple of weeks. But the problem is that the school quality assurance officers are part of the Ministry of Education, but the water education officers are part of PROG, which is a decentralized local government implementation organization. And so they can do these follow-up activities, but they don't actually report or don't even have any official channels of communication or information flow directly between these two different units. Right, and so this is a probably badly drawn graph. I just want to show there that when the school quality assurance officers, I don't think I can have draw a line here, but the information flows high up into this decentralized local government implementation organization and might flow down then again to these water education officers if they're lucky. And what we really just wanted to do is that dotted red line that's what we wanted to do. We just wanted to create this direct information flow, and also I will show a chain of command between the two so that they can actually do these follow-up visits in order to make sure that these schools are actually implementing these recommendations that are part of these whole school visits. Great, so what we did is, it was just a very cheap sending text messages to water education officers. What we did is we hired one person who would call the school quality assurance officers, get access to the recommendations, summarize it, and then send it as a text message to the water education officers. And every 2 months, we would send reminders to them to say to just follow up on these recommendations to make sure that the school is implementing them. Very importantly, we had a workshop prior to the whole program where all the stakeholders were involved, where it was very clear that this information that we are sending actually comes from PROG, the local government ministry. So the water education officers receive a text message saying, your boss is telling you to follow up on this. And so in that sense, it was officially sanctioned. So it's not just the information flow, but also the kind of authority chain was kind of streamlined in the process of doing that. And so just very quickly on sampling experimental design, we wanted this to be nationally representative. So we did data collection across the whole country, and we stratified by these 6 different regions in the country. We randomly selected 23 different districts. It's at the district level really that this implementation takes place. And then we selected a ward in every single one of those districts and randomly selected one school in each ward. So randomization was then at the ward level, which is at the implementation of these ward education officers. And then we have a classic randomized control trials stratified by district, where we have 2 different treatment arms. The one is the standard government implementation, and then the second one is this additional text messages that we were sending the water education officers, and then there was also a control, and they were only supposed to receive these whole school visits at a later stage. I just want to, this is probably one of the most important figures, even though it's not a result, is it was kind of decentralized implementation as well. So we didn't have complete control. The first dotted line shows our baseline data collection. So some whole school visits did take place in the treatment groups and the control groups prior to our data collection started. And really, it was only in about halfway through the first year in 2019 when in the treatment, these schools received the whole school visits. That massive jump is because I had to meet a target by end of June. And so I think there was a bit of a rush. The implication though is I'll be showing intent to treat estimates, which is just comparing averages across these treatment arms. But you should think about it, it's actually roughly 40% larger, the impacts on the actual schools that receive the whole school visits. And then the challenge is we did 3 rounds of data collection. Baseline is the first dotted line, midline is the second dotted line, and then end line split across the summer holidays is the 3rd round of data collection we did end of 2020 and early 2021. But over that time period, right, whole school visits were being conducted in the control schools. We weren't completely able to stop them from doing that because they had these targets they had to meet. All of this just to say that, especially at Endline, our second round of data collection, because far more schools had received whole school visits in the control, it's a little bit harder to interpret the dynamic effects across time because of that. It's much easier to interpret the impacts at midline, but then there's not a lot of time to actually have seen adjustments and changes in longer term outcomes like learning. Also something to note is like
4 minutes.
4 minutes, great. Yep. So also just something to notice that even during COVID, a lot was still, a lot of these visits were taking place as well. So let me just say quickly that these whole school visits were well implemented. Teachers were being observed in the classroom. These exit meetings took place, but the ward education officers only were there about half the time. So that was a challenge. Another important figure showing that the information gathered actually correlates with teacher value added, meaning that they actually were very good at creating information during these whole school visits that are actually predictive of growth and improvement in student learning over time. But we don't really see, maybe in the one arm, the head teachers realized they could do better at management than they thought they did, but not really big changes in beliefs. Definitely no big changes in beliefs about how to prioritize learning and what components to prioritize, but also not large, maybe slightly small improvements in the monitoring that's done by the school, by the leadership. But overall, we don't see big results in actual beliefs and behavior from the school leadership. There is maybe some behavior. This is not focusing only on what the ward education officers are doing, and they're more likely to follow up in these arms where they were encouraged to do that. But again, these are small magnitudes, but we might not be measuring really the dimension where big change is happening. But the kind of important result that I want to highlight here is that we did see improvements in teaching practices, but only in this treatment arm where these WAOs were sent these text messages. That's the second treatment arm called Visit and Text. Massive increase in teacher attendance and also an overall teaching quality score, which is based on the World Bank Teach Classroom Observations. And a lot of it is driven by having increased task on time. So that's all very positive. And so on student learning, we really, and this is now at Endline, so this is now a year and a half roughly after these whole school visits took place in the treatment. Some had happened in the control by then. Very small impacts, but statistically significant, but only for this one program. We are still trying to figure out why there's a negative result for the whole school visit. It's not because they got better at doing these whole school visits over time. There's only about half the schools received the whole school visits in the control. So it's not about the implementation taking over in the control. And so we still have to figure out exactly and unpack that negative result. But in a way, the purest experimental design is between these groups, and there's about 0.11 standard deviation improvements just from sending these text messages. I do want to emphasize. Say again?
1 minute.
I do want to emphasize relative to the growth that took in the control over those 2 periods of 0.72 standard deviations, it's not a lot. We didn't shift the needle immensely. We can't write home and say we solved the problem in Kenya, in Tanzania's education. Just to conclude quickly, we find that this ambitious national rollout of this school governance reform program had no impact. But when combined with its low-cost measures of encouraging follow-ups from the ward education officers, we do find small improvements in teaching practices and student learning. The big implication is that small changes to the institutional processes could really matter a lot and could make a big difference, and systems alignment between these different ministries and units are very important. It's encouraging given the fact that we found all these null results in different contexts, but we still are investigating exactly what's going on in that negative result that we're seeing. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Jakubus. Now back to the Oxford Hub, where Lee is going to talk to us about the study of senior officials in 36 developing countries.
I hope you can all hear me. Great, and my slides. So this is a project with colleagues at the Center for Global Development. And if Gabriella's talk was thinking about management within a school, and Jacobus was thinking about management from the Ministry of Education to the school, we're kind of looking at the relationship between the global kind of sector and countries. If the theory of change of RISE is that we're going to have these conferences and we're going to change the zeitgeist in education, and that's going to filter down to countries, we're kind of looking at that relationship. So this is this graph shows Google search hits for the phrase learning crisis. So if from Google Scholar, so it's really there's your impact for the RISE program. It's really shot up. It's exponentially growing. But are policymakers in developing countries paying attention to this learning crisis? And this kind of matters because this graph just shows spending, and the little teal lines are aid spending in different countries, and the grey lines are national government spending in these countries. So aid is a small, tiny share of aid spending on education in most countries. So it really matters what governments are spending their money on. And do we know, are policymakers aware of the learning crisis? Are they prioritizing the learning crisis or not? And anecdotally, we had this sense that priorities were elsewhere, perhaps around employment skills and higher education, rather than these foundational skills. That was kind of our anecdotal impression. So we set out to collect some data. And last year carried out this survey with over 900 officials from 36 low and middle income countries. We tried to pick countries that receive lots of aid money, so they're kind of in this relationship with global donors, and that have particularly low levels of learning. And so it's mostly in Africa, but also a few in Asia and Haiti. The respondents are mostly a director in a Ministry of Education. We also have some, assistant or deputy directors, some senior directors, a few more junior people, and a few ministers or deputy ministers in there. But the modal respondent is a middle-aged man, 3/4 of men, and is a director in a Ministry of Education. We have a 70% overall response rate, which we were quite pleased with, and we achieved that by hiring consultants in each country to go and get these interviews, however they were able to, whether they were administering them face-to-face by kind of doorstepping people in the ministry or by phoning people up. It was, by any means. And so what we find, we kind of confirm our priors that policymakers have this really strong preference for vocational education over foundational skills. And then we try to unpack a bit why this might be the case. It could be that they have different objectives that they're thinking about for the education system. It could be that they have different beliefs about reality, about the way things are. They may not recognize the crisis. And it could be that they just think there's nothing they can do about it. So maybe they have different beliefs about the effectiveness of interventions to improve learning. So let's go through these. So the first on measuring policy preferences, we started just by asking them up front. We picked the sustainable development goals as a starting point and added in the foundational literacy, which is one of the sub-indicators of the sustainable development goal targets, and which is most important for your country. We're a little surprised that early child development actually came up as a strong third priority, third preference. But you see TVET, technical and vocational education, and employment skills and secondary coming up there above foundational literacy. We then asked if you're thinking about some new money that was on the table, if there's a new aid project, what would be your top priorities for that? And again, you see TVET comes out top above the other categories. But we thought that maybe people may suffer from some social desirability bias. They may know that we're coming from the UK. They may tell us about foundational literacy, even if they don't really prioritize it. So we did some discrete choice or conjoint experiments, which helped a bit to kind of get rid of that that bias, and it gives you some quantitative estimates of how much they prefer different projects. So concretely, you're presented with these two hypothetical projects with randomly generated characteristics, and you're asked to choose, do you want project A or project B? They have different dollar amounts, they're in different sectors. And from repeating this process for all of these 6 times for each respondent, you can look at the average preferences across these projects. And this is the regression results that you're 10 percentage points more likely to select a project if it's a TVET project versus any of the other sector types, and the others are similar basically. So there's a really strong preference for TVET projects, and that percentage point change is similar in magnitude to a $10 million change in the budget. So it's a really strong preference. So why is this the case? First, different objectives. So we did a second conjoint experiment thinking about, you could choose between 2 states of the world, 2 outcomes of the education system with different characteristics. One with the number of children achieving foundational literacy, the second with the number of children completing secondary school, and then the third, the number of children who become dutiful citizens. And we kind of struggled with the phrasing on that a little, but we were trying to capture this idea of socialization and nation building that is a role for education. And you can see there's this really clear preference for producing dutiful citizens over producing any of these measures of human capital. As economists and as outside donors, we might be more inclined to care more about just pure skills and human capital, when clearly, we're not the first people to point this out. People have been writing about this nation building socialization function of education for hundreds of years, but we have an estimate here, a quantitative estimate for how much more important they consider it to be than these other objectives. So maybe that's part of it. Second, different beliefs about reality. So do they think there's a crisis that they need to address? We asked people up front, do you agree that there's a global learning crisis? And overwhelmingly they say yes. And do you agree that there's a national learning crisis in your country? And they also say yes. But they underestimate the scale of this crisis. When you ask them how many children do you think can read in your country, the average guess is around 50%, and the actual database estimate based on learning assessments is more like 25%. So they're really overestimating the skill level of children. And we ask a similar question about how many years of education do you think children are getting, and how much are you spending on education? There was much less bias in those 2 numbers. So we're perhaps more used to seeing data on schooling and on spending, and perhaps less used to seeing comparable data on learning, despite all the efforts of people here and many people in the sector. Second, perhaps they think that education's not so important. We did a similar exercise to Jensen and others have done, looking at the perceived returns to education. So we asked people, how much do you think children are going to earn as adults if they have primary or secondary school? And you can then compute their expectation of the labour market returns to education. And the average was about 60%, which is pretty close to the actual database estimate of the returns to education in these countries. If anything, they slightly overestimate it. So it's not that they don't think schooling is useful. They see the returns there. So do they think we can do anything about learning levels? So first we asked this Carol Dweck growth mindset scale, which is a series of questions around intelligence. Do you think intelligence is something you can change, or is it something that's just fixed? And if you think intelligence is fixed, then it's a bit of a lost hope. And it's quite mixed here. It's quite an even spread, but there's a lot of people who do agree that intelligence is fixed and something you can't change very much, and have this fixed mindset. So that's perhaps a little worrying. There isn't really great comparable data on adults in other countries and what other people think. There's been lots of these studies done with young people, but yeah, less with adults. And it chimes with some other literature looking at the beliefs of teachers in low and middle income countries, who in some cases have been shown to have a similarly fixed mindset. And then we went to some interventions to improve learning. So we did this, we asked this little vignette. we told respondents about one of 3 studies on scripted learnings, scripted lesson plans, scripted learning, which is one of the interventions in the World Bank and FCDO Smart Buys report. It has, some good evidence behind it that this works. Do people know about it? And do they think it works? So we asked people first of their prior. There's this study. What do you think the effect was on learning? Do you think it was small, medium, large, or no effect? And then we told them the results of the study and said, what do you think the effect would be if this was replicated in your context? So do you think there's something you can do about this in your context? And then got their second estimate. And this shows their second estimate from these 3 studies. One of these is Jacobus's study from South Africa, but they're all, somewhat similar. And overall, people thought these would have large or at least medium effects. So people, do think it's possible to improve learning, clearly, from this. So putting it all together, we've got these kind of, this narrative argument about these plausible candidates. So we here run the regression. So we have, on the left-hand side, people's preferences for foundational learning or for TVET on the other side. And then on the right-hand side, we have all of these different factors. Not quite all, it's still work in progress. And this plot shows the coefficients from these regressions. And so as a kind of benchmark, you see if you work in a separate TVET agency rather than a Ministry of Education, you have a really strong preference for TVET, unsurprisingly, by around 0.6, 0.7 standard deviations. And then across these other factors, the one that really sticks out is the belief about the foundational learning levels, which kind of accords with our priors around this. So if you think that learning levels are really bad, you also have a higher priority for foundational learning and a lower priority for TVET. So the people who know about the problem have a higher priority for that, addressing the problem. This is entirely observational, non-causal, so subject to all those caveats. We think it's a interesting first stab at understanding this problem. And the other factors don't seem to have such a big effect. It looks like the men are less likely to have a preference for foundational learning. So women also have a stronger priority for early learning and early skills. So I'm early. To sum up, national policymakers seem to have this clear, strong preference for technical and vocational education and less enthusiasm for foundational literacy. And we explain this as a function of these different factors. And it seems that their beliefs about the scale of the learning problem is it's really stark, and it seems to be correlated with their preferences across different policies. So yeah, we're still finalizing the paper on this, so really appreciate comments. And we're also preparing a second round of this survey to be fielded soon. So we're hoping to dig more into some of these issues. Thanks. I'll hand back to you.
Wonderful. Presenters ending early is always a pleasure. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to make their way to the front for Q&A. And what we're going to do is I'm going to start by reading an online question, and that's for Jacobus, who's in the DC Hub. And right after Jacobus answers, let's take a live question at the DC Hub. Then we'll do a live question at the Oxford Hub. And then after that, we'll go to a live question at the Abuja Hub. So hubs just get people ready by mics. Right, so the question for Jacobus, it's from Abhijit, and it's a multiple-barreled question. So first, is it fair to say that you can never really reject equality between the 2 treatment arms, even for teacher practice, without correcting for multiple hypotheses? And if so, would you say that this is a mode of implementation that donor money shouldn't be going towards much in the future? And then a related question from Sai. what would be an alternative? So lots of high dollar speculation for you to work on first, Jacobus.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me in the rest of the world?
Yes, we can.
Great, excellent. So I'm maybe enjoying too much being part of a global conference. So yeah, those are great questions. And Abhishek, you're mostly right, definitely at midline. We can't reject equality for our important outcomes. At endline for learning, our one, the texting arm is doing much better than the visit arm, but only because the visit arm is doing worse. And so the question is, should governments be doing this? Donors across the world have been really pushing for this kind of reform. It's been the donor darling recently. And so, I mean, it's a bit more of a nuanced answer, of course, because all departments have school inspectors, and now they're reformed, and some parts of it are, we would say, intrinsically theoretically good, focusing on learning and focusing on teaching practices. And so the answer isn't to throw it away. Clearly, there might be this might be a necessary condition of having this information, and then has to be combined with other components, or there must be ways to improve it. But definitely in terms of donor money, I think probably targeting efforts towards thinking of other ways of improving learning is probably necessary, but we shouldn't reject all kinds of school quality assurance at the same time, and rather think of ways of improving it.
Do you want to speculate a bit about the, sorry, the question disappeared, but what are alternatives to this? Or would you rather pass?
Oh, yeah, I mean, let me speculate. Clearly, I mean, I think you need monitoring, you need oversight, you need quality assurance. I think, let me just mention quickly there was another question on was it the quality of the feedback? And maybe just quickly mention on that, often the feedback was, oh, you should be doing participation-based learning and student-centered learning. So there's these buzzwords that are thrown out. And it's very likely that the feedback on the actual quality of the teaching is very generic, the kind of feedback that they give. And so, you know, one thing that we've been working with Tanzanian government and donors is to think about ways of maybe improving the way that you actually observe the teaching in the classroom. And so it's far more of it's moving way more towards teacher professional development in the sense that you kind of give more targeted feedback and you give way more guidance to these people observing teaching in the classroom to really focus on elements that you know that are important. Because clearly giving feedback, we know from Piper's work in Kenya, can be incredibly important. And so I think it's that kind of guidance and structure given to the school quality assurance officers could be very effective.
So even more like nurses and less like policemen is the message I'm getting. DC Hub, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I had a question for Lee. I was wondering if these some of these respondents are elected officials, and if the political economy of these preferences, if they value vocational training because the returns in terms of political support are larger, and if you ever thought of measuring their time preferences to see if they, if the way they discount gains affects whether they value foundational skills more than vocational skills, because those returns can be more immediate.
Thanks, that's a great question. That's a great opportunity for me to plug the second survey, which in the first round we focused on the bureaucrats, on the civil servants in the ministries, and in the next round we're hoping to try and interview members of parliament and legislators. So we'll hopefully be able to show that difference. And yeah, my hunch is, as someone has told me explicitly in a ministry once, that talking about early child development's all very well and fine, but we have an election in 2 years, so that's going to pay off in 22 years. It's not helpful. Whereas, the unemployed, angry youths who are knocking on the door, perhaps a bit more relevant for that. But I think, it seems that officials in at least some countries face similar pressures to re-elected officials.
Great. Thanks, Lee. Now we'll do a question at Oxford Hub, and after this question, Abuja Hub, you're up, so do get ready. I see a question from Masala and a question from Claire, both in Oxford. Masala, do you want to ask your question? Just speak it out loud, and the mic should pick you up.
Okay, if there is any variation by violence type, in a sense, because except those physical violence, there could be underreporting, whether staff training could bring some change. Is there also is there a need for something training or some information to the students themselves instead of the staff? Because I'm not sure how much this staff training will be transferred to the victims as well.
Gabriela, could you summarize the question into the lapel mic in case anyone didn't hear?
Perfect. Thank you very much. That's a great question, and it is about the types of violence. So mainly trying to understand a bit more. I explained mainly about the number of reports of violence. So the question is more about if there is a difference regarding the type of form of violence. So I mainly analyze this at an aggregate level, but I do analyze keeping only the schools that reported cases of violence. I descriptively try to see if there is differences in the type of violence, and I observed that both for those that were treated and those about the treatment, the distribution of the type of reports of violence is very similar. The majority of reports are reports of physical violence, around 50%. Then we have psychological violence, and 15% it's sexual violence.
Thanks, Gabriela. And over to you, Abuja Hub.
A wonderful presentation by Lee. Why do you select your respondents from Ministry of Education and you restricted them to director and deputy directors?
Sure. I mean, so we included anyone who we thought had some interaction with aid donors focused on education, who might, if we think about these ideas, filtering their way through from the global to the national, who might be paying attention, reading these World Bank reports, and who is influential in deciding policy in ministries. So the main focus was on directors in ministries of education, but we also included a few respondents, say from the Ministry of Finance, who may have had some connection with aid, and people from other education-related agencies. So if there's an independent TVET agency or a higher education ministry. But yeah, that was the rationale.
Thank you. We have, I think, a clarifying-ish question from Basal Noorani for Yakubus. So were you presenting ITT effects are late, adjusting for non-compliance? And also, what are your hypotheses around the negative results? Perhaps schools and the visit-only treatment substitute away from effort following the visit. And could you test this by using variation in timing of the visit relative to when you measure outcomes?
That's a very good technical question. I only reported the intent to treat because it was just far more easier to do it that way, which basically means the local average treatment effect on those that actually received the school inspections is roughly 40% higher overall. On the negative results, we are flawed and stumped, and there's a lot of hypotheses that we can kind of slowly go through. The fact that it's only negative in English is one indicator that maybe there's a big priority on focusing on Kiswahili, and so maybe there's reallocation of effort unproductively towards Kiswahili, and so we need to look into that. We looked into whether it's just that they got better at implementing the program, but so far we don't have a lot of evidence on that. Your suggestion on looking at this heterogeneity is a very good idea. We are going to do that. The only challenge, of course, is that it's non-random. The timing, it's only random. Our experimental variation of whether they got it or not, and so we can't really. The conclusions will be a bit harder to make, but we definitely have to do that just because. There's this differential timing and lags going on at the treatment and the control group between the timing, because some effects might just die down, right? And then the treatment took place in the control group, and then there was this kind of temporary bump that we're seeing that's explaining this negative result in the treatment group. Yeah, we will be looking into that in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jacobus. I'm going to do another question in Oxford that came through for Gabriela, and also DC Hub, Abuja Hub. If you do have more questions, just use the raise hand function, and I'll try to keep a lookout for that. So this question's from Claire. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I thought it was a really interesting talk. Thanks. I was just wondering, I really appreciate you haven't yet had time to look at long-term impact, but do you know of any evidence from other maybe descriptive studies that have tried to track whether learning outcome improve after an increase in reports, and if so, whether there's any hypothesized mechanism? In particular, I'm thinking around school exclusions.
So there isn't a lot of evidence in general in the topic, and it has even been highlighted that we need to find more evidence regarding medium and long-term effects. So especially when I have seen the evidence that it's analyzing the impact of other programs that have been analyzed, they focus mainly on violence-related outcomes. So they don't show us more the story about what happens with learning and other outcomes. And there are other two papers, also one in Peru and one in Uganda, that try to study also this, but it's also short-term. So I think we still need to figure out better how these channels would then translate into better learning, perhaps. In terms of the mechanisms, with exclusions, you mean, for instance, removing a school? I think that could be partly one alternative. Like, I think at the end, what this can achieve, it's better environment in general in the school, by the school being able to signal that they are actually taking violence in a serious way. And in the case of Peru, in the protocols, it's very clear that if there is a case of sexual violence, the result will be the removal more of the teacher. And in case when it's teacher to student, student to student violence, they're a bit more careful in terms of removal of the student, and they're trying to follow more approach of dealing with the topic and trying to talk the situation through with the students, because they don't want to for it to end up in dropout of the students. So I think there is it's just, I think, a topic that needs much more exploration. So hopefully we can have more data to see this at the medium and long run.
In your postdoc career.
Maybe, exactly.
Let's go to the Abuja Hub for another question.
Okay, for Lee, there's this preference for TVET by the policymakers. I want to know whether that was demand-driven. Is it from need assessment?
Thanks, that's a good question. I mean, it's come, a couple of people have asked similar questions, like, is it just that there's already lots of aid in a particular sector, or is it just that there's not a problem in a particular place? That's work we still need to do to dig a bit more into the descriptive characteristics of each country to see if we could show anything there. We're a bit limited by having 36 countries, so we could do some cross-country analysis there and see if preferences correlate with actual provision. Yeah, there's more to do to unpack that.
Thanks, Lee. And we have an online question for Jakubus from Aiden. So Twaweza are testing innovative ways for school quality assurance officers to observe and assess teaching during their visits. What do you make of the idea to offer teachers immediate feedback, especially on learning outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think that's great. I think better even is, of course, to train them in how to assess students and encourage them to assess students themselves, so they can have that information. I think the most important feedback for teachers would be how well they're teaching, and I think there are good ways of even relatively unqualified government bureaucrats to get good training in order to give good feedback to teachers if they're just given enough structure and guidance. In general, I was just thinking all the evidence yesterday about how all this parental involvement arms, really only work if it's about support and not accountability. We might have really done a disservice as economists by focusing on accountability so much the last couple of decades, and just looking at how also evidence on teacher professional development, how teacher motivation increases when they get more support, and in general, I think far more focusing on helping them be better at their teaching, I think is higher returns to effort.
Thanks, Jakubus. Next, let's do another online question. This one's for Gabriella from member Gomina. So did your research find at any point, look at the consequence for school violence or ill discipline? Might higher consequences increase students or parents' confidence around reporting violence? And did you have any way of measuring parent or student confidence in reporting violence? And actually, I think this might relate to part of what Claire was asking just now, because when Claire said school exclusions, I think she was using the British term that means you suspend children who are responsible. So yeah, consequences for violence.
So definitely, I think one consequence in terms of increasing trust in reporting, I think definitely the intervention aims to increase the trust in reporting. If you face any case of violence, you can either use an online reporting system, or you can directly talk to the school staff about it. And I think the intervention aims to achieve this, increasing in confidence. And I think the results might be reflecting that as well. Also, because I observed that when I analyze who reported the case of violence among the schools that benefited from the intervention, I see a higher number of reports that have been reported by students and not, for instance, by the staff or peers, because the system in general, the reporting platform that is available in the country allows for other people to report the violence. This includes teachers, includes peers, even family members. So I think in that sense, it does allow to increase trust. So I think that as a consequence, in the long term can allow to improve the environment of the school and potentially in the long term also result in less violence.
Thanks. We're going to go to the Abuja hub, but just before that, I want to note there are lots of questions coming in that we probably won't be able to get to, but rest assured that we will relay them to the presenters, so they will see all of your thoughtful reflections on the paper and nothing goes to waste. Abuja hub, all yours.
Okay, looking at the title, Improving School Management of Bullying, and you may agree with me that bullying could be phenomenal at all levels of education. Now, I want to ask, what are the effective mechanisms for managing and controlling psychological bullying against postgraduate students? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This study is more focused on what happens in schools, but definitely I agree that it's important to put a lot of focus also on psychological bullying. Sometimes there is more focus on other forms of violence, and psychological bullying can really affect also aspects related to mental health and of course the performance of the students. And this is not only in primary or secondary school, but also, of course, in postgraduate situations. So I think definitely it's important to for the institutions to be aware of these and to create mechanisms to allow for identification and report of these things. And this is not only for schools, but of course, to other levels of education, including universities as well.
I'm going to ask one final online question to Lee, and then after that, Jacobus, we'll try to give you 30 seconds for any last words. So Lee, this is a question from Kat. Did you find any countries that were outliers, that is, where policymakers did understand the reality of the lack of literacy skills? And if so, what are your hunches for why these countries were outliers? And can we learn anything from them if we want to address the learning crisis? So if you could answer in a minute, then we'll give Jacobus 30 seconds.
Yeah, my colleagues will probably hate me for speculating so wildly from the little data, but I think that the respondents from Kenya and Tanzania and Pakistan were less off the mark than in other places. 3 countries where the citizen-led assessments are there, so it seems plausible that that's having an effect and showing up. I think I'd love to try and see if we can pin that down any more precisely, because it's 3 data points out of 36, so it's hard to say anything conclusively there, but yeah, it's possible that they're working.
Oh, that's a tantalizing 3 data points. Jacobus, any last thoughts in 30 seconds? Then I'll share some closing thoughts from Renata.
This is a fantastic conference. Thank you so much, Katie and the rest of the RISE team. You're doing an amazing job. And thank you for Team Nigeria. It's got a massive turnout. It's quite a privilege to be able to talk to people across the globe. So thank you very much. This is always the highlight of my year. I'm glad I can do this in person again. It's just my time.
Thank you, Jacobus. I wasn't accidentally fishing for compliments, but hey, that's always nice to hear. So I did want to say, so one closing thought from me is that I'm very aware that this might be my bias from staring at the RISE framework and teacher motivation literature so much, but it seems to me that these papers all really show us that beliefs are tremendously important, and also how we understand each other's beliefs are. So when we talk about policy, when we talk about management, it's not just aligning the components of a policy, but aligning how we see and how we interpret the priorities and what the policy is actually trying to achieve. And a last point that Renata wanted to emphasize, and Renata's based at the World Bank, and she says that as someone working in an international organization and supporting policymakers in developing countries, she's often asked questions about how governments can do better in managing certain aspects of education systems like food services or health services in schools, or disaster preparedness or pedagogical support, or evaluation of large-scale programs from the ministry. And often we just don't have that much evidence for the management of these activities because they're hidden from the public eye, they're ignored by the literature, they're a bit less glamorous and tweetable, I suppose. So she says she really welcomes the 3 papers on this panel because they really do help to put the spotlight on them, and also help to integrate them under the theme of management, so we can reflect really on hidden management within the education sector. So thank you so much to all our panelists. I enjoyed myself tremendously, and I hope everyone else did too. Thank you.